You think you can just walk away from me. You see, there is no police, there is no help in here.
Please, not in front of him.
I never thought a Tuesday afternoon grocery run would be the day I realized the system I'd trusted twice had never actually been on my side. Theo had been asking all week if we could get the cereal with the cartoon bear on the box, not the store brand, the real one. He'd been so patient about everything. The smaller apartment, the second-hand backpack, the birthday cake I'd made from a box mix, instead of ordering from the bakery on 5th like I used to. But he was 7 years old and he never once complained. So yeah, I was getting him the cartoon bear cereal. Like this video right now, if you already know this story is going to be something special. Share it immediately, because the friend who needs a story like this will thank you before it's even finished. And subscribe. Before you go 1 second further, I work the register at Fresh Mart 6 days a week. I know every aisle of that store by heart. Aisle 9 is condiments, mustard, ketchup, pasta sauces. It's where I always cut through to reach the cereal section faster. I'd done it 100 times. I didn't think twice. That was my mistake. I heard him before I saw him. That specific sound, boots on linoleum, moving with purpose, moving toward me, is something my body learned to recognize before my brain even caught up. 6 months of freedom, and my nervous system still remembered. My hand tightened around Theo's. Then Kieran stepped out from behind the end cap display. And every breath I'd taken since leaving him felt like it had been borrowed time. He wasn't supposed to be within 500 feet of me. The restraining order was specific. I had filed it myself. Sat across from a clerk with shaking hands, said every word clearly. I had done everything right. Twice. The first time, the officer told me it was a domestic dispute and suggested we both cool down. The second time, Kieran showed up to the station looking calm and reasonable and walked out 20 minutes later. Both times, I was the one who went home, afraid. So when I saw him in that aisle, I already knew. No one was coming. There were people everywhere. A young couple reading sauce labels 3 feet away, 2 women with a shared cart near the olive oils, a teenage store employee stacking shelves at the far end. Everyone close enough to see. Nobody moving. They never do. Mara. And his voice was quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. That particular quiet meant he'd already decided how this was going to go. We need to talk. I turned Theo slightly behind me. We have nothing to talk about, Kieran. He stepped closer. I stepped back. My heel caught the bottom shelf and I stumbled, just slightly, just enough. And that half second of imbalance was all he needed. His hand came up fast and his finger jabbed hard into my cheekbone, right into the bruise that hadn't fully faded from 3 weeks ago. The pain was instant and humiliating. You filed another report. His voice was still low, still calm. Drop it. Or I call my cousin at Family Services and tell them about that mold in your bathroom ceiling and the fact that you've been leaving a 7-year-old alone while you work night shifts. He tilted his head. How do you think that hearing goes for you, Mara? I felt Theo press his face into the back of my jacket. And I felt the people in the aisle not moving. I felt my phone in my pocket, completely useless, because I'd called before, and before hadn't worked, and calling again while his finger was already in my face wasn't going to produce a squad car in the next 30 seconds. There are moments when you understand with total and terrible clarity that you are alone, that the structures built to protect you are either too slow or too indifferent or too easily charmed by a man who knows how to seem reasonable. I had 2 police report numbers saved in my phone. I had a restraining order in my email. I had done everything a person is supposed to do. And I was standing in aisle 9 with my son, hiding behind me and a bruise on my face, and nobody in that store was going to help me. Then something changed. I didn't hear him approach. I don't think anyone did. What I noticed first was the couple near the pasta sauce. They just moved, not walking away, just shifting. the way people shift when something large and certain enters a space. Then the store employee at the end of the aisle straightened up and went very still. And then I saw him. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, in a way that the white dress shirt he wore somehow made more obvious rather than less. His collar was open just enough to reveal the edge of the tattoos that climbed his neck, dark ink against pale skin, the kind of detail that makes you reassess everything else about a person immediately. His dark hair was swept back. His hands were in his pockets. He was walking down the aisle at the pace of a man who had nowhere to be and no reason to rush. And that unhurried quality was the most unsettling thing about him. He stopped about 6 feet away from us. He looked at Kieran. And he smiled. Not warmly. Not the smile of a man who was about to introduce himself or ask if everything was okay. It was a slow, quiet, knowing smile. The smile of someone who has just been handed an opportunity they find genuinely interesting. Like Kieran wasn't a threat to him. Like Kieran wasn't even a problem yet. Like Kieran was simply something that was about to be handled. Kieran, who had never backed down from anyone in his life, who had talked his way out of 2 police stations and intimidated 3 of my neighbors into silence. Kieran went still. "Can I help you?" Kieran's voice had lost some of its quiet. The certainty was draining out of it in real time. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, just briefly, taking in the bruise. Theo pressed against my back, my posture, and something behind his eyes went from measured to decided. Then he looked back at Kieran. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unhurried, carrying the faint trace of an Eastern European accent, worn smooth by years, somewhere else. "You should leave now," he said. "Well, that's still a choice you're making yourself." 3 sentences. That was all. And somehow, Kieran Walsh, who had put his hands on me in 2 different parking lots and a stairwell, who had laughed at a restraining order, who had never once in 6 years been made to feel afraid, took one long look at the man in the white shirt, and his jaw tightened, and he looked at me one last time with something I had never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like recalculation. Then he left. Theo slowly unwound his fists from the back of my jacket. My legs were shaking. The couple near the pasta sauce pretended to read labels again. The store employee went back to stacking shelves. The world simply resumed. I looked at the man still standing 6 feet away. He had made no dramatic movement. He had raised no voice. He had simply arrived, and the problem had departed. "Are you all right?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. Later, I would Google his name from the card his associate pressed into my hand on the way out of the store. Roman Kaslov. I would find a name that appeared twice in local crime journalism, always as a rumor, never as a charge. As a man described in one forum thread as someone the city's own organized crime figures referred to as the landlord. A man connected to nothing provable and everything feared. I would tell myself not to call. I would look at my phone the night Kieran got my shifts cut, when I had $43 in my account, and Theo needed new shoes, and my manager wouldn't meet my eyes when she told me the supplier had restructured the contract. And I would dial the number. But that comes later. What I need you to understand first, what I need you to feel the way I felt it, is what it's like to be failed by every official thing that exists to protect you. And then, to watch a single man walk into an aisle, smile once, and accomplish more in 30 seconds than 2 police reports and a court order ever did. That Tuesday, I learned something that took me a long time to make peace with. The law had my paperwork. Roman Kaslov had my back. Ahmed, and I had no idea yet what that was going to cost me, or give me, or change in me completely. He didn't follow Kieran out. He didn't watch him leave. The moment Kieran turned the corner at the end of the aisle and disappeared, Roman Kozlov simply looked away from the space where he'd been standing, the way you look away from a television you've switched off. And that was that. Done. Finished. Not worth the continued attention. He looked at me instead. I was still pressed against the shelf, and one hand behind me, keeping Theo tucked close, the other hanging at my side, doing absolutely nothing useful. My cheek was throbbing. My legs had that hollow, post-adrenaline feeling where they work fine, but you don't fully trust them. I was trying very hard to look like a woman who had this under control, and I was failing completely. He didn't comment on that. He just waited, giving me a second to reassemble myself, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. "Are you all right?" And it was the second time he'd asked. His voice was the same as before, low, unhurried, accented in that barely there way that made each word feel like it had been selected carefully before being released. No urgency in it, no performance of concern, just a straightforward question from a man waiting for a straightforward answer. "Yes," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Thank you." He nodded once. Not the nod of someone accepting gratitude. Yeah, more the nod of someone closing a small administrative task. He glanced down briefly at Theo, who had emerged from behind me and was now staring up at Roman with the wide, unblinking assessment that only 7-year-olds can get away with. Roman looked back at him without condescension, without the exaggerated warmth adults usually perform for children they don't know. He just looked at him evenly, the way he might look at anyone. "You okay, kid?" Theo considered this seriously. Then he nodded. His name is Theo," I said, because I needed to say something. Roman didn't offer his own name. He was already stepping back slightly, creating distance, not crowding us. And that small courtesy registered somewhere in the back of my mind as unusual. Most men in the aftermath of something like that would have leaned in, would have wanted the gratitude up close. That's when the associate appeared. I hadn't noticed him during the confrontation, which told me he'd been positioned deliberately, somewhere I wouldn't look. He was younger than Roman, dark-jacketed, the kind of build that made the jacket look structural rather than decorative. He materialized at Roman's shoulder, the way people do when they've been trained to appear, exactly when needed, and not a moment before. He held out a card between 2 fingers. "In case you need anything," he said. His accent was thicker than Roman's, newer, less worn down. I took it. I don't know why. Reflex, maybe. Or maybe because every other thing I'd reached for in the last 6 months, the reports, the order, the hotline, the manager who said she'd look into it, had turned to paper in my hands. And this card was the first thing anyone had physically pressed into my palm like it might actually hold weight. Roman had already turned to go. He didn't look back. I stood in aisle 9 with a business card between my fingers, a bruise on my face, and my son's hand back in mine. And I watched Roman Kozlov walk out of the condiment section with his hands back in his pockets, like he'd simply taken a slightly longer route than planned. We got the cartoon bear cereal. I don't know why that detail stays with me, but it does. I put it in the cart. I paid for everything. I drove home. And then I made Theo dinner and sat with him while he ate, and I read him 2 chapters of his book, and I turned off his light, and I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet under the sink, and I shook for about 10 minutes straight. Then I picked up the card. R. Kozlov. Private. Just that. A phone number. No company name, no title, no address. The cardstock was heavy and cream-colored, and the font was plain. It told you nothing and somehow communicated everything. And I put it face down on the counter. I picked up my phone and opened a browser. I typed in Roman Kazlov. The first page of results was mostly nothing: a LinkedIn profile for a civil engineer in Sweden with the same name, a genealogy forum entry, a local business registry, listing for a property management company called Kaslov Holdings, LLC, registered 6 years ago. Boring, corporate. The kind of search result designed, I later understood, had to be exactly what it was: a clean surface over deep water. I scrolled further. The third page was where it started. A thread on a true crime forum, 2 years old, 47 replies. The original post was titled, "Anyone else notice the Grayfield warehouse case was dropped the same week K Holdings bought the block?" I read the whole thread. Most of it was speculation, the kind of breathless dot connecting that forums specialize in. But 3 or 4 posts in the middle of it had a different quality. Specific. Restrained. The posts of someone who knew more than they were saying and was being careful about how much they released. The name that doesn't appear in any filing, but appears in every conversation, is Kaslov. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'll say. I closed that tab. I opened another one. A local news archive piece from 4 years ago. A crime reporter named Weston Graff had written a profile, more of a sketch, of the shifting, organized crime landscape in the city following the arrest of a man named Pribble. The piece mentioned in the second-to-last paragraph a figure the reporter described as an emerging, consolidating presence, Eastern European origin, known in certain circles as the landlord. A reference sources suggest not to property, but to the understanding that everything operating in this city does so on his terms, at his sufferance, and by his permission. The name Kaslov did not appear in the article, but there was a photograph, taken from a distance, grainy, clearly without the subject's knowledge, of a man leaving a restaurant. Broad shoulders, white shirt, dark hair swept back. I put my phone down on the counter next to the card. I sat with that for a long time. There is a specific kind of fear that isn't loud. It doesn't spike your heart rate or make your hands shake. It settles. It gets comfortable in your chest, like it's planning to stay. That's what I felt sitting in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, with a business card and a browser history, and a bruise still pulsing on my cheekbone. The man who had just made Kieran Walsh. Kieran, who had never been afraid of anything or anyone. Turn and walk away without a word. That man was not a good Samaritan who happened to be passing through the condiments aisle. That man was something the city's own criminals called the landlord. That man had handed me his number like it was nothing. I turned the card face down again. I was not going to call. I lasted 9 days. The first 3 were almost normal, or what passes for normal when you're checking over your shoulder in parking lots and flinching at footsteps behind you in stairwells. Theo went to school. I went to work. I ran my register and smiled at customers and counted down the hours, and came home and locked the door and felt, if not safe, at least stable. On the 4th day, my manager, Linda, called me into the back office. She couldn't look at me directly. Linda is a decent person. I want to be clear about that. A woman in her 50s who has worked at Freshmart for 14 years and genuinely tries to be fair. The fact that she couldn't look at me told me everything before she said a word. "I'm so sorry, Mara. There's been a restructuring with the primary supplier contract. Also, the new arrangement requires us to reduce cashier hours by about 30% across the board." She paused. "Your shifts are being brought down to 2 days a week starting Monday." "Across the board," I repeated. She finally met my eyes. Just for a second. "Linda, is anyone else's hours being cut?" She didn't answer. She looked back down at the paper in front of her. I left her office and went back to my register and finished my shift because I had no choice. And near cut to the way home, I did the math in my head, 2 days a week, at my hourly rate after tax, minus rent, utilities, Theo's after-school program, groceries, and the minimum payment on the one credit card I'd maxed out moving into the new apartment. The number at the end of the calculation was not a number you could live on. It was a number designed to make a specific point. You cannot survive without me. That was Kieran's message, not sent in a text. Oh, not said to my face, sent through a supply chain, through a cousin who knew a distribution manager, through a meeting I would never be in the room for, through paperwork that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with me. He had reached into my ordinary Tuesday morning and rearranged it without leaving a single fingerprint. I drove home. I put Theo to bed. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I looked at my bank account and I looked at the rent notice and I looked at the card still sitting on the counter where I'd left it 9 days ago. I had 2 police report numbers. I had a restraining order. I had done everything right, and I had 2 shifts a week and a bruise fading to yellow on my cheekbone, and a 7-year-old who needed the cartoon bear cereal and new shoes and an after-school program because I couldn't afford a sitter. I picked up the card. I typed the number into my phone. My thumb sat over the call button for long enough that the screen dimmed once. I pressed it before it could dim again. It rang twice. Yes, not hello. Just that single word, quiet and immediate, like he'd been expecting a call. Maybe not mine specifically, but some call, always some call, at any hour. "This is Mara," I said, "from the grocery store, aisle 9. A beat of silence, not the silence of someone trying to place me. The silence of someone who already had. "I know who you are." I had prepared a kind of speech in my head on the drive home. Something measured and clear that established I wasn't asking for anything dangerous or complicated, just some advice. Just a name of someone legitimate who could help. It all dissolved the moment I heard those 4 words spoken in that quiet, certain way. "He cut my hours," I said instead. "Through his cousin. I can't prove it. I can't fight it. And I can't afford to just wait it out." My voice held. I was proud of that. "I don't know what I'm asking exactly. I don't know what this is, but I didn't have anywhere else to go." Another silence. Shorter this time. "Where do you work?" "Fresh Mart on Caldwell, but I don't want anyone to—" "I'm not going to walk into your store, Mara." Something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly. Not warmth exactly, but the removal of distance. "I'm going to make a phone call. The supplier contract will be reviewed. Your shifts will be restored." A pause. That's all. Just like that. Just like that. I didn't ask how. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table at 11:30 at night, that asking how was not the right question. The right question, the one I should have been asking myself, the one I probably wasn't ready to answer yet, was what it meant that I'd called, what door I'd opened, and what I'd just agreed to by dialing those 10 digits and saying I didn't have anywhere else to go. But Theo needed his after-school program, and I needed my shifts back. And sometimes the door that opens when every other door is locked is not the door you would have chosen. It's just the door that opens. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," Roman Kaslov said. And then, before I could ask what that meant, "Get some sleep." He ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes. Phone in hand, card on the counter, lamp making a small yellow circle of light in an otherwise dark apartment. Somewhere down the hall, Theo was breathing the deep, unbothered breath of a child who trusts that the world is being managed by adults. I hoped he was right. On Monday, Linda called me into the back office again. This time she was bright-eyed and apologetic, and told me that the supplier had reviewed the contract terms and there would be no changes to existing staff hours after all. But she seemed genuinely relieved. She also seemed, in some small way I couldn't quite name, slightly unsettled. The way people are when something resolves itself too cleanly, too quickly, without any of the friction that resolutions are supposed to require. I thanked her and went back to my register. That night, on my way home, I passed aisle 9 without cutting through it. I took the long way around, past the bakery section, past the flowers in their plastic buckets near the entrance. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was the feeling that aisle 9 was where one version of my life had ended, and something else had started, and I wasn't ready yet to walk through it like it was nothing. Because it wasn't nothing. I had called Roman Kaslov. He had answered in 2 rings. He had made 1 phone call and rearranged my reality before I'd finished explaining the problem. And I had absolutely no idea what came next. He never asked me to explain myself. That was the first thing I noticed, the absence of the debrief I'd been bracing for. Every other time I'd sought help, formally or otherwise, there had been a process. Forms. Questions asked in a particular order designed to establish timeline and credibility. The officer who needed me to explain why I hadn't left sooner. The hotline volunteer who was kind but working from a script. Even my sister, who loved me, had had a tendency to circle back to the beginning. But what did you say right before he... And did you try telling him that? As though the right combination of words on my end might have produced a different man on his. Roman asked nothing. Within 48 hours of that phone call, my shifts were back. All of them. Linda sent a group message to the cashier team on Tuesday morning. Great news, the supplier has confirmed the original contract terms, and no changes to anyone's schedule. And I read it standing in my kitchen, still in my pajamas with a coffee going cold on the counter. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 6 months. Not safe. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. The specific relief of a pressure that has been quietly pressing on your chest suddenly lifting, like the first full breath after a long time of breathing shallow. I texted the number on the card. Shifts restored. Thank you. And I kept it short because I didn't know what register to use with him yet. Every instinct I had was calibrated for men who needed managing, men who needed to be thanked the right way, approached the right way, never made to feel diminished or questioned. I didn't know what Roman needed because he didn't seem to need anything. He had simply acted, and the situation had changed, and that was apparently the end of his interest in the matter. He replied 4 hours later. A single word. Good. And then, 1 week after that, Kieran showed up at Theo's school. I got the call at 2:40 in the afternoon, 20 minutes before pickup. It was Ms. Farrell, Theo's classroom teacher, careful, measured, clearly trying not to alarm me while also clearly alarmed. A man matching Kieran's description had appeared at the front gate at lunchtime, she said. He had told the front office administrator he was Theo's father and that there had been a family emergency. The administrator had followed protocol, and which meant checking the custody documentation on file, which meant discovering the restraining order, which meant calling the principal, which meant, by the grace of that administrator doing her job correctly, Theo had never left the building. I was in my car before Ms. Farrell finished the sentence. Theo was fine. He was sitting in the principal's office eating a granola bar, apparently unbothered, telling the assistant principal about a video game. As he hadn't known anything unusual had happened. I held him for probably 45 seconds longer than he thought was necessary. And he tolerated it with the sighing patience of a 7-year-old who has learned that sometimes his mother needs a moment. I drove home. I got Theo settled with his homework. I went to the bathroom, ran the tap so he wouldn't hear me, and I called Roman. He picked up on the first ring this time. I told him what had happened. I kept my voice level, and I was proud of myself for keeping my voice level. When I finished, there was a pause, not long, maybe 4 seconds, and when Roman spoke again, Something in his tone was different, not louder. Roman was never loud, but there was a quality in it that I can only describe as a door closing somewhere, quietly and with finality, on a room that would not be reopened. "I'll handle it," he said. "I don't want to know the details," I said. "I need to be clear about that." "You won't," he said. But it's handled. I don't know what happened. I kept my word about not wanting to know, and Roman kept his word about not telling me. What I know is that Kieran did not come near Theo's school again. What I know is that 3 days later, my neighbor Mrs. Petro mentioned she'd seen a large black car parked outside our building twice that week and assumed it was someone's relative visiting. What I know is that the particular flavor of dread I had been carrying for 6 months, that background frequency of he could appear anywhere, anytime, and nothing will stop him, went quieter after that. Not silent, but quieter. Whatever Roman had said to Kieran, it had accomplished in one conversation what 2 police stations and a family court clerk and a restraining order had failed to accomplish in 6 months. I sat with the ethics of that for a long time. I'm still sitting with them, if I'm honest. We started meeting occasionally, not formally, not with any declared intention. He would text to ask if everything was stable. I would answer. Sometimes the answer led to a brief conversation. Once he mentioned he was near my neighborhood and asked if I'd eaten. I said no because it was 5:30 and I'd been running registers since 8 in the morning and I hadn't had anything since a granola bar at noon. He named a diner 2 blocks from my building and I told him I knew it, and I went. He was already there when I arrived, in a corner booth with his back to the wall. A positioning choice I recognized as habitual, instinctive, the reflex of someone who has spent years making sure no one could approach unseen. He had coffee. He was reading something on his phone with the same focused stillness he seemed to bring to everything. We talked for 2 hours, not about Kieran, not about the school incident or the supplier contract or any of the machinery he'd set in motion on my behalf. We talked about Theo, his granola bar stoicism, his video games, the way he'd apparently told his teacher that his favorite animal was a medium-sized dog, not too energetic. Roman listened to this with an attention that didn't feel polite. It felt genuine, which surprised me. I asked him at some point in the second hour what he had been doing in that grocery store, and it had been bothering me since aisle 9. He didn't look like a man who did his own shopping. He didn't look like a man who needed to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a woman on Caldwell Street. Older. She has trouble with the stairs, so she can't carry bags easily. I have someone pick up her groceries once a week." I looked at him. "That's why you were there? You were picking up an old woman's groceries?" "Dropping them off. She lives above the laundromat." I didn't know what to do with that. It didn't fit the forum threads or the crime reporter's careful paragraph, or the heavy, cream-colored cardstock. It was too ordinary, too quiet, too much like something a person did because they simply believed it was the right thing to do. "Who is she?" I asked. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, "Her name is Vera. She knew my sister." He said it plainly. At the way you say things that have been said so many times internally that the words have lost their jagged edges, even if the thing underneath hasn't. I didn't push. I had learned by that point that Roman volunteered information in his own time, or not at all, and that waiting was more productive than asking. He reached into his jacket after a moment and set his wallet on the table between us, not opening it, just setting it there. Then he opened it and turned it so I could see inside the billfold section. Behind the cards, tucked flat, was a photograph. Small, slightly worn at one corner. A young woman, maybe 20, dark-haired and smiling at whoever was behind the camera with the unguarded smile of someone who didn't know they were being photographed. Her name was Petra, he said. She was 22. Her boyfriend at the time. He paused, a brief calibration. The system had 3 reports on him. 3. And then one night it didn't matter how many reports there were. He closed the wallet. I didn't say I was sorry. It seemed insufficient to the point of being almost insulting. I sat with it instead, the way it deserved to be sat with. "Is that why you stepped in?" I said. "In aisle 9. He looked up at me. "I step in when I can. I wasn't there when it mattered. So now I'm always there. There are things you understand in your head and things you understand in your chest." And I had understood Roman Kozlov as dangerous before that dinner, and I still understood him that way. That hadn't changed. But I had added something to the understanding, a layer underneath the danger that was not softness exactly, but was grief. A man who had built an empire of control because one night he had been powerless, and someone he loved had paid for it. A man carrying a photograph in his wallet 7 years later because he hadn't figured out how to put it down. I recognized the carrying. I had been carrying things too. We just carried them differently. On the walk home from the diner, I made a decision. I told him when we reached the corner of my block, standing under the amber wash of a streetlight, with my jacket zipped to the throat against the October cold. "I need to do this part myself," I said. He looked at me. "The legal part, the hearing. And I've been in touch with a victims advocacy organization. They have a lawyer who handles restraining order violations pro bono." I'd found the number through my nurse friend Addie, who had texted it to me the week before with 3 exclamation points, and "Please call them." "I have an appointment next Thursday. I'm going to go through the proper process, and I'm going to stand up in that room and say what happened and let the court do what courts are supposed to do." I paused. Not because I think it definitely works, but because I need to know I did it. I need Theo to know I did it. Roman was quiet. I couldn't read his expression well in the streetlight. I'd gotten better at reading him over the weeks, but he was still largely opaque when he chose to be. I kept going. "I'm not saying I'm not grateful, I am. What you did, the shifts, the school situation, I don't take any of that lightly, but I can't build a life on someone else's fear. And even if that fear is working, even if it's easier." I looked at him directly. "I need to be the one who ends this." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The same nod from aisle 9. Not agreement exactly, more like recognition, like I had confirmed something he had already suspected about me. "Thursday," he said. "Good." That was all. No argument, no reassurance, no attempt to redirect. He simply accepted what I'd said as a reasonable and final decision, and that was that. And I had been prepared to defend the position at length, and the defense turned out to be unnecessary, which left me slightly off balance in a way that I found, walking the last half block home alone, unexpectedly moving. Most people in my life, even the ones who loved me, had opinions about my choices. Roman had none. Or if he had them, he kept them where they belonged, his own. I met the lawyer the following Thursday. And her name was Priya Anand, and she was 34 years old and precise in the way of someone who has heard every version of every story, and still chooses to show up. She went through everything with me. The 2 police reports, the original restraining order, the school incident, the shift reduction, and its connection to Kieran's network, which she noted carefully and said could potentially support an additional harassment claim. She told me the case was strong. She told me what to expect. And she told me the truth about what courts could and couldn't guarantee, which I appreciated. She also told me at the end of the appointment that her firm's fees for this kind of case were covered by a legal aid fund she'd recently received an anonymous contribution to. substantial enough to handle several cases at full capacity for the rest of the year. The contribution had come in 2 weeks prior. I sat with that information on the bus ride home. And the timing was not a coincidence, and I knew it wasn't a coincidence. And Roman knew I would eventually figure out it wasn't a coincidence. He had said he wasn't going to stand in my way. He hadn't. He had simply, quietly, made sure the path I'd chosen to walk was a little less obstructed, without telling me, without asking for credit, without placing himself in the room. I thought about a man carrying a photograph in his wallet for 7 years. And a man who dropped off groceries for a woman named Vera, who had known his sister. A man who stepped into a grocery aisle with his hands in his pockets and his voice at a normal volume and made everything change. I didn't call him that night, but I thought about it. The hearing was in 3 weeks. Priya said to rest and prepare and let her do her job. I told her I would. I went home and made dinner and sat with Theo while he told me, at considerable length, asked about the medium-sized dog he intended to own when he was grown up and had his own house. "What will you name him?" I asked. Theo considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Roman," he said, "because it sounds strong." I looked at my son for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "it does." Priya told me to wear something simple, not to perform distress and not to perform composure, just to be a person, clearly and plainly, and in a room full of people whose job was to decide whether my account of my own life was credible. She told me the goal was not to win an argument. The goal was to tell the truth in a way that couldn't be dismissed. I wore a dark blue blouse I'd had for 3 years, and flat shoes, and I put my hair back because I needed my face to be visible, and I needed nothing between me and whatever was coming. Theo came with me because there was no one to leave him with on short notice, and because, as after I'd explained in careful 7-year-old terms that we were going to a room where I was going to tell some important people the truth about some things that had happened, he had looked at me very seriously and said, "I want to come. I can be quiet." He was. He sat in the public gallery with Mrs. Petrou from downstairs, who had offered without being asked, and he held her hand, and he watched. Roman was already in the gallery when we arrived, seat near the back, right side, dark jacket. And he wasn't looking at me when I walked in. He was looking at the front of the room with that particular stillness of his, like a man who had been waiting long enough that waiting had become simply a neutral state. When I passed the gallery on the way to the respondent's side, I didn't stop. But I saw him see me. And something in my chest settled, just slightly, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall that has been very gently straightened. I did not look at him again after that. That was intentional. Kieran's lawyer was a man named Fitch, mid-40s, navy suit, the practiced ease of someone who treats family court as a procedural inconvenience rather than a moral reckoning. He had a way of asking questions that technically solicited information while functionally delivering verdicts. I had been warned about him. The early portion of the hearing was administrative: documentation, the existing order, the dates, the incidents logged. Anupriya presented everything methodically and without drama, which I had come to understand was her style. She built the case the way you build a solid wall, one brick at a time, no flourishes, nothing that could be easily knocked loose. Then Fitch stood up. His approach to me was pleasant in the performative way of a man who has calculated that pleasantness is strategically optimal. He smiled before asking questions, which I recognized as a technique. The smile says I am being reasonable. So any resistance from me reads as she is being unreasonable. I had been warned about that too. He began with the history of my relationship with Kieran. Not the incidents, the relationship. He asked about the beginning. He asked about shared finances, about the apartment we'd lived in together, about whether we had ever discussed a shared custody arrangement for Theo. He asked these questions in a tone of genuine curiosity, as though he was simply trying to understand the full picture. and as though none of it had been strategically selected to establish a narrative of ambiguity. The narrative being two people with a complicated history, a woman who had chosen, at various points, to remain. A situation that could be read by a reasonable person as mutual and messy, rather than one-directional and deliberate. I answered his questions. I answered them all. I did not add to them, did not editorialize. I did not take the bait of his follow-up phrasing when it was designed to reframe what I'd just said. Priya had spent 2 sessions preparing me for exactly this, and I sat in that chair, and I used every minute of that preparation. Then Fitch asked, "Ms. Voss, isn't it true that you've had other individuals become involved in this dispute on your behalf? Individuals whose methods of resolving conflict may be considered unconventional?" I heard the gallery shift slightly. I looked at Fitch as I kept my voice level. "I contacted a victims advocacy organization and retained legal counsel," I said. "That's the involvement I'm aware of." He held my gaze for a moment, deciding whether to press. He let it go. Whatever he'd been angling toward, he didn't have enough to land it cleanly, and he knew it. He sat down. Priya stood up and asked me 3 questions on redirect. They were precise and purposeful, and she had told me in advance what they would be. The first, in your own words, what happened at Freshmart on October 4th? I told it. The cereal, the aisle, the boots on a linoleum, the finger in my cheekbone, the crowd with their phones, the restraining order that existed on paper in a courthouse and had done absolutely nothing in that aisle. I said it plainly. I didn't reach for emotional language. I didn't need to. The facts, stated plainly, were sufficient. The second, what happened at Theo's school on October 14th? I told that too. The call from Ms. Farrell. As the 20-minute drive. Theo with his granola bar, unbothered, because the administrator had done her job. What would have happened if she hadn't? The third, how has the pattern of behavior described in these reports affected your ability to work, to provide for your son, and to feel safe in your daily life? I took a breath. I looked at Theo. He was sitting very straight in the gallery next to Mrs. Petrou, both hands in his lap, watching me with the focused attention he usually reserved for his books. He wasn't scared. He was paying attention. He had told me that morning, tying his shoes in the hallway, that he was coming to watch me be brave. I looked at him and I spoke to the room. I said that for 6 months I had operated in a permanent state of managed fear, that I had filed 2 police reports and obtained a restraining order and followed every piece of official advice available to me, and that the system had failed to protect me or my son from a man who had simply decided the rules didn't apply to him. I said that what I wanted, what I had always wanted, what had never changed, was not revenge and not drama. I wanted to take my son to a grocery store on a Tuesday without calculating escape routes. I wanted to go to work without checking whether my hours had been quietly gutted as punishment for existing independently. I wanted my son to be 7 years old without knowing. That's on some cellular level that his mother was afraid. I said, I am not unstable. I am not vengeful. I am a woman who has been telling the truth about the same man for 2 years. And I am here, again, telling it. The only thing that has changed is that this time, I have a lawyer, and the evidence is finally being taken seriously. I stopped. The room was very quiet. I looked away from Theo and back at the judge, whose expression had not changed throughout, but whose pen had been moving steadily for the last several minutes. I had said what I came to say. Every word of it was mine. The judge ruled from the bench. Criminal violation of the restraining order, the school appearance, combined with documented evidence of the workplace interference presented by Priya through supplier chain communications, Kiran's associate had carelessly left in writing, was sufficient for sentencing. At the workplace, interference supported a separate harassment and economic coercion charge that Priya had filed as a companion case. Kiran was sentenced to 18 months. A permanent restraining order was issued, not the temporary, renewable kind that expired and required me to reappear and re-justify my own fear on a schedule. Permanent. The words sat in the courtroom, and I felt it land in my chest like something being set down after a long time of being carried. I didn't cry. I had thought I might. I'd had some idea that this moment would arrive with a wave of something cinematic. It didn't. It arrived quietly, like a faucet being turned off, like a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot it was there. And then it stops, and the silence is so absolute, it takes a moment to recognize as peace. Priya shook my hand in the corridor afterward. She squeezed it once, which was its own kind of language. Theo ran to me from Mrs. Adipatro and wrapped both arms around my waist, and I held him there in the courthouse hallway, under the fluorescent lights, and I thought, this is what 2 years of telling the truth looks like. This is what it costs and what it weighs and what it finally becomes. I did not look for Roman on the way out. By the time we reached the corridor, he was already gone. 3 months later, I moved. Not far. 2 neighborhoods over. A 3rd-floor apartment in a building with a working elevator and a landlord who answered texts. It had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with a window above the sink and a small patch of morning light that crossed the table at breakfast, like it had been designed specifically for that purpose. It cost $40 more per month than my previous place, which was now within reach because my hours at Freshmart were stable, and I had, in November, been offered a shift supervisor position that came with a modest raise. Theo picked his room immediately and decisively, the way he made most decisions. He wanted the one with the view of the parking lot because he liked watching cars. I gave him the one with the view of the parking lot. On the first Saturday in the new apartment, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee going warm and Theo eating cereal. The cartoon bear kind. As always, the cartoon bear kind. When the post that had been forwarded from my old address arrived in a small stack. Bills, a catalog, a pizza flyer, and a white envelope from the Northside Community College School of Nursing. I had applied in November. The application had taken me 3 evenings and a lot of Addie texting me encouragement. And one very long phone call with a woman in the admissions office who had talked me through the requirements patiently. And I had applied because Addie was a nurse and had been telling me for 2 years that I would be good at it. And because I had spent the last several months understanding in new ways what it meant to need help and not have it arrive. And because, at some point during all of it, I had stopped organizing my future around what was survivable and started considering what was possible. I opened the envelope. Theo looked up from his cereal. "What is it?" I read it once, then again. It's a letter from a school," I said. "What kind of school?" "Nursing school." I set it on the table. "They're saying yes." Theo considered this. "So you'll be a nurse?" "I'll be studying to be one for 2 years, and then yes." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his cereal. Then, after a moment, "Will you still make dinner?" "Yes, Theo. I will still make dinner." "Okay," he said. Good." I sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with the acceptance letter in front of me and my son eating cereal across from me, and I tried to locate the feeling I was having and put a name to it. It wasn't happiness exactly, or it was happiness, but happiness had always felt to me like a temporary weather condition, something that came and went and couldn't be relied upon. This was different. This was more like ground, solid, ordinary, unglamorous ground, the kind you could build on. And I had been surviving for so long, I had forgotten that surviving was supposed to lead somewhere. He knocked on a Sunday evening about a month after we'd moved in. I hadn't given him the new address. He knew it anyway, which I had decided to find more reassuring than unsettling, which probably said something about how much had shifted between aisle 9 and now. He was standing in my doorway in a dark jacket, collar open, one hand in his pocket and the other holding a book. A children's book. The illustrated kind, thick pages, a dragon on the cover. He looked, standing in that doorway with a dragon book in his hand, and no prepared explanation for his presence, like a man who had spent years being exactly certain of where he stood in every room and had arrived, for the first time in a long time, somewhere he wasn't sure of. I found that I liked seeing him unsure. It was the most human he'd ever looked. "Theo likes dragons," I said, and he looked down at the book briefly. I didn't know. I guessed. "Good guess?" I stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in the way he did everything without gloom. Without rushing, without making it larger than it was. He looked at the apartment once, taking it in, and something in his expression settled in a way I recognized now as his version of approval. He didn't comment on it. He didn't need to. Theo appeared from the hallway in his socks, assessed Roman for approximately 2 seconds, and then looked at the book. "Is that for me?" "If you want it." Theo took it, examined the cover with the focused scrutiny he applied to all incoming material, and looked up. "Do you like dragons?" Roman appeared to give this genuine consideration. "I have no strong feelings about dragons." "I do," Theo said seriously. "Come sit down." And that was that. No negotiation, no ceremony. Theo had decided, and Theo's decisions in this apartment were final. He led Roman to the kitchen table and climbed into his chair and opened the book, and Roman sat down across from him, and I stood in my own kitchen doorway and watched a man who ran a criminal empire get instructed about dragon mythology by a 7-year-old in socks. I made tea. I brought 2 cups to the table and set one in front of Roman without asking if he wanted it, because it was my kitchen, and that's what you did in your own kitchen. And he wrapped both hands around it and didn't say anything, but the set of his shoulders changed in a way that I had come to understand meant something. Theo reached a page with words he didn't know and pushed the book toward Roman. "What does that say?" Roman looked at it. "Impenetrable," he said. "It means nothing can get through." Theo repeated it carefully. Then, "Like a shield?" "Like a shield," Roman agreed. As I sat down at my own table with my tea and my nursing school acceptance letter, still on the corner of the table where I'd left it that morning, and outside the kitchen window, the late evening light was doing something unhurried and golden across the rooftops, and my son was learning new words. And the man across the table from him was teaching them with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. I had spent 2 years in a state of managed fear, and I had spent 6 months rebuilding from rubble. I had stood up in a courtroom and said the truth out loud, and watched the truth do what it was supposed to do. I had applied to nursing school on a Tuesday night, after Theo went to bed, and I had been told yes. I was not surviving anymore. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening, and I was simply, quietly, ordinarily, completely living. I looked at Roman. He was reading to my son, one finger tracking the line. At his voice low and even and unhurried. He looked up and found me looking and held it for a moment. Not the calculating, measuring look of our first encounters, but something easier than that. Something that had stopped needing to assess and had started simply seeing. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. We didn't need to. Some things don't announce themselves. They just arrive, quietly and without fanfare. And they sit down at your kitchen table and they stay. Like this video if this story gave you everything you came for. Share it. Because someone in your life needs to hear a story about what real loyalty looks like. And subscribe, Because every single story on this channel is built to hit exactly like this one did. You found this channel for a reason. Stay.